Hello, folks. As we enter into our study of the nervous system, one of the first things we're going to talk about are cell types found in the nervous system. In this video, I will be talking specifically about the types of neurons, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe the location of these neurons, characteristics of them. We'll also talk about the general structure of a neuron. You'll also see in this video listed the various types of glial cells. That's an odd word, G-L-I-A-L, glial cells. But we won't really talk about those in this particular video, but in the next lesson we'll be talking about glial cells. So what we're going to see here is that there are several types of neurons. And there are several types of glial cells. And as I mentioned, I'm only really going to talk about the neurons in this video. But we break down nervous tissue cells into these two types. Neurons are the cells that actually carry action potentials, carry the signal from one place to another, perhaps from a sensory cell in the skin, or one of the special sense organs that we have, eyes, hearing, smell, those sorts of things, carrying that into the brain, or a receptor in an organ or something like that. The neurons are actually going to carry that signal through to the brain. On the other hand, neuroglia are cells that play a sort of supporting role. They might act as electrical insulation. They might act to facilitate the transfer of nutrients to nerve cells and the removal of wastes from nerve cells. Really, there's various functions for the glial cells that we're going to talk about, but like I said, for a later time. So this first slide here showing a neuron is showing us what we would typically refer to as a multipolar neuron. And I'm going to save what that is because I just want to talk about the structures that we see here. At one end of this neuron, we see these many branches, many branches. And these are called dendrites. Dendrite is a word that means branch, like a tree. I think either Greek or Latin for tree or to branch is dendros or something like that. So you could check me up on that. Maybe you could check for that. But we see these dendrites branching off of what we call the soma, or the cell body. These dendrites are going to be receiving some sort of stimulus, some sort of message. And in this type of neuron, they would typically be communicating with another neuron. So they would be receiving messages from another neuron. And we can kind of see that in the shadows here. But they're going to be on the receiving side. On the other end of the neuron, we see these other branches. And we see that there are fewer. These are called the axonal terminals. Okay, we see these axonal terminals. And the axonal terminals are actually going to be sending a message out. Typically a chemical message. It would be a neurotransmitter, right? You've heard that word maybe before. So they're going to send a neurotransmitter out to something. It could be some other neuron. It could be sending a message to a muscle cell. It could be sending a message to a gland to secrete something. But just generally, we refer to the cell on the receiving side as the postsynaptic cell, because it's on the receiving end of the synapse. And we refer to the cell on the sending side as the presynaptic cell. So the presynaptic cell is going to be the one that distributes or releases neurotransmitter. The postsynaptic cell is going to be the side that receives neurotransmitter. It's going to have these receptors. And we would see, if we look closely, if I could zoom in on these dendrites, we would see those receptor sites for neurotransmitter, or for some maybe sensory reception or something like that. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of neuron types. This first type, I do want to mention, is not typically seen in vertebrates, but we do see it embryologically. Sort of developmentally, we see these unipolar neurons. But where we do see them, we see them as a sensory neuron. In joints, it shows here in joints, but again, we're talking about invertebrates here. So we're not in, most of us have backbones, right? We can stick up for ourselves, we have backbones. We typically don't see these, I say typically, we don't really see these in humans, except embryologically, but in invertebrates, they're quite plentiful, they're common. And some of the places we might see them are here listed. We do see bipolar neurons. These are, again, a little bit rare, but they're not rare as in they aren't found. They are found specifically in special sense organs. When we talk about special sense organs, we're going to see a lot of these bipolar neurons. And we call them bipolar neurons because the cell body has two appendages. Unlike the unipolar neuron, where there was only one appendage coming out of the cell body, in a bipolar neuron, we're going to see that there are two. One side would be the dendritic side, and one side would be the axonal side. So messages would come in, pass through, and pass out of the neuron. So they would pass in on the dendritic side and pass out on the axonal side. And like I said, they are typically found in the sensory organs, olfactory epithelium, in the eye and the retina, and so on. So not real common out in the body, but common enough that, you know, they're always, it's not like it's not like we might look at the eye and not see them. This is what we see there. That's what we see in the olfactory organ and so on. So multipolar neurons are very common. They're the most common type of neuron probably in the human body. We find these in the central nervous system. And if you think about the way the central nervous system functions, we have many neurons in our brain communicating with one another. It would make sense that there are many pathways to reception on a neuron. So this neuron might be receiving signals from several other neurons, and those several other neurons and the connections that these neurons make are what, you know, ultimately house our thoughts and memories and things like that. But we see these commonly in the central nervous system. And motor neurons and sensory neurons are going to be both sort of uniquely and equally represented here in these multipolar neurons. But we call them multipolar neurons because look at the cell body. Look how many branches are coming out of the cell body. By the way, this drawing would make an awesome like sci-fi alien creature. It looks like it has like an eyeball and all these weird appendages. But you see these branches. There are many coming out, so it's called a multipolar neuron. Okay, and the last type is called a pseudo-unipolar neuron. And the reason why it's called a pseudo-unipolar neuron is because we see this singular branch off of the cell body that then splits. And it's actually an axon that splits. So both ends of these are axonal in nature. And they are typically sensory neurons. This is going to be a relatively common type of neuron out in the body. And it allows the central nervous system to communicate with muscles, allows sensory organs to communicate, sensory organs in the skin to communicate back to the central nervous system and so on. So as you can see, just a few types of neurons to know. Recap, we have a unipolar neuron. Don't really need to know this one for an adult human. Bipolar neurons, because there are two branches from the cell body. Multipolar neurons, there are many branches from the cell body. And pseudo-unipolar neurons, because there's one branch that leaves the cell body, but it quickly splits into two. And it's basically an axon at either end. And it serves the dendritic function on one side and the axonal function on the other. All right, kiddos.